You know, it all started with a simple fascination I've always had with local folklore. Edinburgh is a city brimming with history. Every stone and shadow seems to hold a secret. As a history professor, I've spent years digging through ancient texts and forgotten stories, but there was always this one legend that lingered in the back of my mind. The tale of Agnes MacFarlane, the witch who was burned at the stake centuries ago, haunted me like an unfinished chapter. They say she cursed the entire town with her last breath, vowing revenge on anyone who dared disturb her final resting place. Intrigued? I certainly was. One crisp autumn afternoon, I decided to do more than just read about Agnes. I wanted to see for myself the place where it all happened. There's something about walking the same ground as those who came before us. It brings the past to life in ways books never could. So, I packed a small bag, threw on a warm coat, and made my way to the edge of the city. The woods where Agnes was executed aren't far from Edinburgh, but they feel like another world altogether. The trees there stand tall and silent, like sentinels guarding the secrets of centuries past. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the air grew colder and the light dimmed, even though the sun was still high in the sky. It felt as though the woods were alive, watching my every move. Each step I took seemed to echo in the stillness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. But that's the thing about curiosity, it's relentless. No matter how uneasy I felt, I had to press on. The site of Agnes MacFarlane's execution was rumored to be in a clearing deep within these woods, a place few dared to visit. I must have walked for what felt like hours before I finally found it. The clearing was small, almost unremarkable, but there was an undeniable weight to the air around it. The stories said this was where Agnes had met her fiery end, and standing there, I could almost hear the crackling of the flames and the shouts of the villagers. The ground was uneven, overgrown with roots and moss, as if nature itself was trying to swallow the memory of that terrible day. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in, letting the reality of the place seep into my bones. That's when I saw it, something half buried in the dirt at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was just a clump of dried grass, but as I knelt down, I realized it was something more. It was a small doll, made of straw, bound together with rough twine. It looked ancient, like it had been there for centuries, yet somehow untouched by time. There was something unsettling about it, something that made my skin crawl, but I couldn't look away. I reached out and picked it up, feeling the rough texture of the straw against my fingers. As I turned the doll over in my hands, examining the intricate knots and details, a sharp twig on the ground scratched my finger. A tiny drop of blood welled up and dripped onto the doll. In that instant, a chill ran through me, colder than the autumn air, and the atmosphere around me seemed to change. The light dimmed further, and a sense of foreboding settled over me like a dark cloud. I felt it in my gut. This was no ordinary doll, and whatever I had just done, it couldn't be undone. After that eerie chill settled over me, I knew I had to get out of there, but something kept me rooted to the spot. It was as if the clearing itself didn't want to let me go. I couldn't shake the feeling that the doll in my hand held some kind of power, something ancient and dangerous. But instead of leaving it behind, I did the exact opposite. I tucked it into my bag. I don't know why. Maybe it was a foolish sense of curiosity or a deep-seated belief that this could be the key to understanding the legend of Agnes MacFarlane. Whatever it was, I left the clearing with that doll, and I've regretted it every day since. When I got home that evening, the first thing I did was take the doll out of my bed and place it on the table. It looked even more unsettling in the harsh light of my kitchen. The straw was old, brittle in some places, and the twine binding it together seemed almost too tight, as if the doll was struggling against its own restraints. I couldn't help but feel that it was watching me, though it had no eyes. It's funny how your mind plays tricks on you when you're alone and unnerved, but this was different. This felt real. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just a doll, just an object, nothing more. That night, as I lay in bed, the events of the day kept replaying in my mind. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the doll and felt the chill of the clearing. Around midnight, I finally drifted off, only to be jolted awake by the sound of something crashing downstairs. My heart was pounding as I crept down the stairs, half expecting to find an intruder. But when I reached the kitchen, everything was in its place except for the doll. It had fallen from the table and was now lying on the floor, facing the door as if it had been trying to leave. A rational part of me knew it must have been knocked over somehow, maybe by a draft or vibration, but there was no draft, and the air was still. I picked up the doll, trying to ignore the icy dread that was creeping into my thoughts. I put it back on the table, this time making sure it was stable, and went back to bed, determined to get some sleep. But the nightmares started as soon as I closed my eyes. I dreamt of fire, intense heat, and a figure standing in the flames. Agnes MacFarlane, her eyes locked on mine, filled with rage and pain. The flames licked at her body, but she didn't scream. Instead, she whispered, her voice carrying a curse that I couldn't understand but felt deep in my soul. I woke up drenched in sweat. The image of her face burned into my mind. The next morning, I tried to go about my day as usual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. It was as if a dark cloud was hanging over me, suffocating me. I thought about leaving the doll in the clearing, returning it to where I found it, but something told me it was too late. Whatever had been set in motion couldn't be undone. I began to notice strange things happening around my house, objects out of place, lights flickering, cold spots that shouldn't have been there. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The doll seemed to be at the center of it all. It was always in the corner of my eye, no matter where I went in the house. And every time I looked at it, that chill returned, crawling up my spine and settling in the pit of my stomach. I didn't know what to do. Should I get rid of it? Bury it? Burn it? But something inside me resisted, as if the doll had already taken hold of me, as if I was bound to it just as it was bound together by the twine. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. And so, the days went on, each one darker and more terrifying than the last. Things started to get really strange after that. It was like my life was slowly unraveling, and I was powerless to stop it. At first, it was just little things, objects moving on their own, doors creaking open when I knew I'd shut them tight, that sort of thing. But then the nightmares began. Every night, without fail, I would dream of fire, of burning at the stake, with shadowy figures surrounding me, their faces twisted in anger and hatred. They would chant in a language I couldn't understand, but the words carried a weight that crushed my spirit. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, gasping for breath, the fear clinging to me like a second skin. During the day, it was no better. I started to hear things whispers that seemed to come from the walls, from the very air around me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but they grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't ignore them anymore. The worst part was that I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I knew they were directed at me. It felt like the house itself was alive, conspiring against me. I tried to focus on my work, to lose myself in the lectures I had to prepare, but even then, the whispers would follow me, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I told myself I was just stressed, that the doll had nothing to do with it, that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The energy in my home had shifted, turned dark and oppressive, like a storm that was building, ready to break. I started to avoid certain rooms, especially the kitchen where the doll sat. I couldn't bring myself to touch it, but I couldn't throw it away either. It was like it had a hold on me, a grip that tightened with each passing day. The sense of dread that had settled over me was suffocating, and no amount of rational thought could shake it. One afternoon, I came home from work to find my front door wide open. I knew I had locked it when I left, but there it was, swinging gently in the breeze. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, expecting to find my house ransacked, but everything was in its place. Everything except for the doll, which had somehow moved from the kitchen table to the center of the living room floor. It was sitting there upright, facing the door as if waiting for me. The air around it was ice cold, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that house as possible, but I couldn't. Something kept me rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the doll. The whispers grew louder after that, filling every corner of the house, seeping into my mind even when I was at work or out with friends. I started to withdraw from everyone, terrified that if I spoke about what was happening, it would somehow make it more real. My friends noticed, of course, and they asked if I was okay, but what could I say? That I was being haunted by a centuries-old curse? They would have thought I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. The line between reality and nightmare was becoming increasingly blurred, and I didn't know how much more I could take. Then, one night, I woke up to find the doll sitting on my chest, its cold, straw body pressing down on me like a weight. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The room was filled with that awful whispering, louder than ever, a cacophony of voices that seemed to be tearing at my very soul. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed with fear, but eventually, the whispers subsided, and I was able to move. I threw the doll across the room, my hands trembling, but it was no use. The damage had already been done. I knew then that whatever was happening, it was far from over. The nightmare had only just begun. Each day felt like a slow descent into madness. The nightmares that had once been confined to the night began to bleed into my waking hours. I would catch glimpses of her, Agnes MacFarlane, in the shadows, just out of the corner of my eye. Her presence was like a dark stain on my reality, an ominous figure that lurked in the periphery of my vision. Every time I turned to face her, she would vanish, leaving only a lingering sense of dread in her wake. It was as if she was toying with me, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And I couldn't escape her, no matter where I went. My colleagues noticed a change in me before I even fully realized it. I started avoiding social interactions, retreating into myself, consumed by the fear that had taken root in my mind. The world outside became a distant, unimportant place, overshadowed by the darkness that now enveloped me. I stopped going outside unless absolutely necessary, and when I did, I was constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see Agnes there, watching me with those burning, hateful eyes. The paranoia grew with each passing day, until it was all I could do to hold on to the last shreds of my sanity. At night, the nightmares became even more vivid, more terrifying. I would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, the echoes of Agnes's voice still ringing in my ears. She would appear in my dreams, her face twisted with rage, accusing me, cursing me for disturbing her rest. The flames from her execution would roar around us, licking at my skin, but the pain was nothing compared to the fear. It felt so real, as if I was reliving her death, trapped in the fire alongside her. Each time I awoke, the line between dream and reality blurred a little more, until I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. I started to mutter to myself without realizing it, repeating the same phrases over and over again, as if trying to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. But deep down, I knew that whatever was happening to me was real. The spirit of Agnes McFarlane was haunting me, punishing me for my curiosity, for disturbing her final resting place. I could feel her anger like a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. And no matter how much I tried to deny it, there was no escaping the truth. I was being hunted by a force far beyond my understanding. The days blurred together, each one darker and more terrifying than the last. My friends, concerned for my well-being, urged me to seek help, to talk to someone about what I was experiencing. But how could I explain the unexplainable? How could I make them understand that what I was facing wasn't just in my head? I couldn't, so I withdrew further, isolating myself from the world, hoping that somehow, some way, I could find a way to stop what was happening. But the more I tried to fight it, the stronger it became. Everywhere I went, I felt her presence. It was in the rustling of the leaves outside my window, in the creaking of the floorboards at night, in the flickering of the lights when I least expected it. Agnes was always there, just out of sight, but never out of mind. Her face haunted me. Her voice whispered to me. Her anger consumed me. I was losing myself, piece by piece, to the curse that had been unleashed upon me. And as much as I wanted to believe that I could find a way out, that I could escape her wrath, the truth was becoming all too clear. There was no escape. The realization that I was completely and utterly alone in this nightmare was the final straw. It broke something inside me, something that could never be repaired. I stopped caring about the outside world, stopped caring about anything other than the constant, gnawing fear that had become my only companion. I was no longer living. I was merely surviving, drifting through the days in a haze of terror and despair. And I knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before Agnes claimed me as her own. It was only a matter of time before the haunting took a more sinister turn. I had been clinging to the hope that things couldn't get worse, that maybe, somehow, the nightmare would just stop. But the universe had other plans. One morning, I woke up to find strange symbols drawn in ash on the walls of my bedroom. They were crude yet precise, etched in patterns that I'd only seen in my nightmares. The sight of them sent a chill down my spine, freezing me in place. I knew I hadn't put them there, and there was no one else in the house. It was Agnes. It had to be. The symbols weren't the only sign that something was terribly wrong. That very night, I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the same symbols appeared in my mind, burning bright like the flames that consumed Agnes so long ago. They seemed to pulse with a life of their own, drawing me deeper into a darkness I couldn't escape. I woke up several times, drenched in sweat, the symbols still etched in my vision, as if they were branded onto my very soul. It was like the line between my dreams and reality had been erased entirely, and I was stuck somewhere in between, unable to find my way out. I thought destroying the doll might bring an end to this torment, that maybe it was the key to breaking the curse. But every attempt to get rid of it ended in failure. I tried throwing it away, burying it, even burning it, but no matter what I did, the doll would always reappear in my house, looking as intact as ever. It was like it was tethered to me, bound by some unseen force that refused to let go. Each time it came back, the atmosphere in my home grew darker, heavier, and more oppressive. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, like I was being suffocated by the very air I breathed. The violence started not long after that. One morning, I woke up to find scratches on my arms and legs, thin, angry red lines that stung as if they were fresh wounds. I hadn't scratched myself, and there was nothing in my bed that could have caused them. But there they were, undeniable evidence that something was physically attacking me. The realization that I was no longer safe, even in my own bed, was terrifying. Sleep, which had once been an escape from the horrors of the day, became another battleground, a place where I was vulnerable to Agnes's wrath. The doll's presence seemed to grow stronger, more malevolent, with each passing day. It wasn't just an object anymore, it was a conduit, a vessel for Agnes's spirit, and it was feeding off my fear, growing more powerful with every shudder, every scream. I could hear her voice now, clearer than ever, echoing in my mind, demanding retribution for the blood that had been spilled. It wasn't just a curse anymore, it was personal. Agnes wanted revenge, and she was going to take it out on me, no matter what it cost. The whispers that had once been a background noise had now become a constant, oppressive presence, like a chorus of vengeful spirits closing in on me from all sides. By this point, I was living in a state of constant terror. My home, once a sanctuary, had become a prison, and I was its only inmate. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, every whisper in the dark sent me spiraling deeper into fear. I could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was a product of my unraveling mind. I started to lose track of time, the days and nights blending together into one long, unending nightmare. The isolation, the fear, the torment, it was all too much, and I was on the verge of breaking. In a moment of desperation, I reached out to the only people who might have answers, the historians and occult experts who had studied the legends of Edinburgh for years. I didn't want to believe in curses and spirits, in witches seeking revenge from beyond the grave, but I had no choice. What was happening to me was real, and I needed help to survive it. But even as I sought their guidance, I knew, deep down, that the situation had spiraled out of control. The haunting had taken on a life of its own, and I was caught in its grip, with no way out. Desperation drove me to seek out those who might have the answers I so desperately needed. I couldn't go on like this, trapped in a living nightmare with no one in sight. So, I began researching, digging through every book, every article, every scrap of information I could find about Agnes MacFarlane and the dark history of Edinburgh. But it wasn't enough. The more I read, the more I realized that I was in over my head. This wasn't just a legend or a cautionary tale, this was real, and I was at the center of it. I needed help from people who understood the world beyond the physical, who could see the threads of the curse that had entangled my life. I reached out to historians who specialized in the occult, people who had spent their lives studying the supernatural aspects of our city's past. They were skeptical at first, as you might expect, but as I told them about the symbols, the doll, the nightmares, and the haunting, I saw the skepticism in their eyes turn to something else: concern, fear even. They told me that the doll wasn't just an artifact. It was a conduit, a vessel that had been activated by the blood sacrifice. My blood. It was the key that had unleashed the spirit of Agnes MacFarlane, and now it was the source of her power. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about an old legend or a cursed object, this was about me. By disturbing her resting place and bleeding onto that doll, I had somehow linked myself to Agnes, binding our fates together in some twisted way. The historians and occultists warned me that the only way to break the connection was to return the doll to the clearing where I found it and perform a ritual to appease Agnes's spirit. But it wouldn't be easy. The bond had already been forged, and the witch's presence was now so strong that she followed me everywhere, her anger growing with each passing day. I knew I had to act quickly, but fear paralyzed me. The idea of returning to that clearing, of facing whatever awaited me there, filled me with dread. The thought of performing a ritual, something I had no experience with, was terrifying. What if I did it wrong? What if I made things worse? But there was no other choice. If I didn't try, if I didn't at least make the attempt, then the haunting would only continue to escalate until it consumed me entirely. I had to find the strength within myself to face this head on, to confront the darkness that had invaded my life. The night before I planned to return to the clearing, the haunting reached a fever pitch. My house was alive with shadows and whispers, the air thick with a malevolent presence. Agnes was making it clear that she wouldn't let me go easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, twisted with rage, her voice a constant, hateful hiss in my ears. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. I was terrified, but there was no turning back now. The only way out was through, and I had to believe that I could find a way to appease Agnes and end this nightmare. Morning came, and with it, a grim determination. I packed the doll, the one object that had brought so much terror into my life, and prepared to face whatever awaited me in that cursed clearing. The historians had given me the instructions for the ritual, but their words had been tinged with doubt. They weren't sure it would work, and neither was I. But I had to try. As I left my house, I could feel Agnes's presence more strongly than ever, a cold, oppressive weight that pressed down on me with every step. She was with me, and she wasn't going to let this go without a fight. As I walked through the woods, retracing the steps I had taken all those weeks ago, the air grew colder, the light dimmer, just as it had on that fateful day. The trees seemed to close in around me, the forest itself a living, breathing entity that sought to swallow me whole. But I pressed on, driven by a desperate need to end this once and for all. The clearing was just ahead, the site where Agnes had met her end, and now, where I would make my stand. I took a deep breath, clutching the doll tightly in my hands, and stepped into the clearing, ready to face whatever came next. Stepping into the clearing felt like crossing a threshold into another world. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, every breath heavy in my chest. The trees that surrounded the space stood like silent witnesses, their branches intertwining above, blocking out most of the daylight. A dense fog clung to the ground, swirling around my feet as if trying to pull me under. I could feel Agnes's presence all around me, a cold, oppressive force that seemed to press in from every direction. This was it, there was no turning back now. I was here to end this, one way or another. I placed a straw doll on the ground in the center of the clearing, the exact spot where I had found it. The moment it touched the earth, the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder, the fog thickened, and the light seemed to fade, plunging the clearing into an unnatural twilight. I could feel the energy building, a palpable tension that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I began the ritual, following the steps the historians had given me, my voice trembling as I spoke the words. The language was ancient, unfamiliar, but the meaning was clear. This was an offering, a plea for mercy. As I chanted, the ground beneath my feet seemed to vibrate, a low, rhythmic pulse that matched the beating of my heart. The fog swirled faster, forming shapes, figures that danced around the edge of the clearing. Shadows moved within the mist, dark and indistinct, but unmistakably human. I couldn't see their faces, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. The fear that had been gnawing at me for weeks was now a living thing, coiling around my chest, squeezing tighter with every breath. But I couldn't stop now. I had to finish the ritual, had to see this through to the end. Suddenly, the fog parted, and there she was, Agnes MacFarlane. Her figure emerged from the mist, more terrifying than any nightmare I'd ever had. Her form was twisted, distorted by centuries of pain and anger. Her eyes, burning with an unnatural fire, locked onto mine, filled with a hatred so intense it almost knocked me off my feet. Her voice, when she spoke, was a guttural growl, a sound that seemed to resonate from deep within the earth itself. She didn't need to say anything for me to understand I had disturbed her rest, and she was here to make me pay. I could feel the weight of her curse pressing down on me, the darkness closing in as she advanced. My hands shook as I completed the final steps of the ritual, my voice barely a whisper now, drowned out by the roar of the wind that had suddenly picked up. The doll lay between us, a symbol of the connection that had brought us to this moment. As I spoke the last word, the earth seemed to tremble, the shadows in the fog growing darker, more distinct. Agnes's form flickered, her features contorting with rage and anguish, but she didn't stop. She was almost upon me, her twisted hands reaching out, ready to drag me into the darkness with her. And then, just as her fingers brushed my skin, the doll ignited. Flames erupted from the straw, bright and fierce, consuming it in an instant. Agnes let out a scream, a sound so terrible it seemed to split the air itself. The fire spread, racing along the ground, tracing the outline of the symbols that had been drawn there centuries ago. Agnes's form wavered, the flames reflecting in her eyes, and for a moment, I saw something other than anger in them: pain, loss, desperation. But it was too late. The fire reached her, and with one final, blood-curdling scream, she was gone, vanished into the night. The silence that followed was deafening. The fog lifted, the cold receded, and the clearing was suddenly bathed in the soft, warm light of the setting sun. The doll was nothing but ash, scattered by the gentle breeze that had replaced the howling wind. I collapsed to the ground, every ounce of strength drained from my body. It was over. The curse, the haunting, the terror that had consumed my life for so long, it was finally over. But as I lay there, staring up at the sky, I knew that I would never truly escape what had happened here. Agnes might be gone, but her presence would haunt me for the rest of my days, a shadow that would never fully disappear.